Tonight, we journey together into the life of one of the most extraordinary minds that has ever walked this earth, Leonardo da Vinci, a man whose genius transcended the boundaries of art, science, engineering, and human imagination itself. This is not merely the story of a painter who created the world's most famous smile, nor simply the tale of an inventor who dreamed of flying machines centuries before their time. This is the story of a soul who refused to accept that there were limits to what one person could understand, create, and become. Imagine, if you will, a world on the cusp of transformation. The year is 1452, and in a small hillside town in Tuscany, a child is born who will witness the death of the medieval world and the birth of modernity. He will grow up in an Italy divided into warring city-states, where artists are beginning to be valued not as mere craftsmen, but as intellectuals, where ancient wisdom is being rediscovered, and where the human spirit is awakening to possibilities that had seemed impossible for 1,000 years. This child, born out of wedlock to a notary and a peasant woman, enters a world that has already marked him as different, as outside the normal boundaries that define most lives. But this very otherness, his standing at the margins of respectable society, will free him to see the world with eyes unclouded by convention. He will grow to become a man of such breathtaking beauty that his contemporaries will speak of him with awe, a mind of such penetrating insight that his notebooks will reveal secrets of nature that won't be confirmed for centuries, and a creative spirit so restless that he will leave behind more unfinished masterpieces than completed ones. Leonardo da Vinci was a man who dissected corpses to understand how muscles move beneath skin, who studied the flight of birds with mathematical precision so he could design wings for humans, who painted with such revolutionary technique that other artists would put down their brushes in despair, who engineered war machines and peaceful canals with equal facility, who could play music that moved listeners to tears, who could design costumes for court pageants and fortifications for besieged cities, who filled thousands of pages with observations, questions, sketches, and insights that would take humanity centuries to fully appreciate. But he was also a man who struggled to finish what he started, who fled from one patron to another across the Italian peninsula and beyond, who faced accusations that threatened his life, who watched his greatest sculptural project destroyed by soldiers using it for target practice, who saw the magnificent courts that nurtured his genius collapse into ruin, and who died in exile, far from the land of his birth, having achieved immortal fame yet feeling, perhaps, that he had left so much undone. Before we step fully into this remarkable journey, I want to welcome you here, wherever you are in the world. Whether you're listening from North America, Europe, Asia, Africa, Australia, or anywhere across this beautiful planet we share, I'm grateful you've chosen to spend this time with me tonight. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, what time it is as you settle in, and what draws you to Leonardo's story. Are you an artist seeking inspiration, a dreamer fascinated by genius, or simply someone looking for a gentle voice to carry you into peaceful sleep? If you enjoy these slow, thoughtful explorations of history's most fascinating figures, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps me create more of these journeys into the past, and I treasure every comment, every like, every moment of connection we share across the digital distances that separate us. Now, take a moment to get truly comfortable. Adjust your pillows, pull your blankets close, dim the lights around you. Let the concerns of today drift away like leaves on a gentle stream. Feel your breathing slow and deepen. When you're ready, close your eyes or let them rest softly on the screen, and come with me as we step into the spring of 1452, into the Tuscan countryside where a child is being born who will change the world forever. The hills around Vinci rolled in gentle waves of green, dotted with olive groves and vineyards that had been tended by human hands since before the Romans came. This was old land that remembered empires and had watched them crumble into dust. The farmhouses and villages that clung to these hillsides were built of stone quarried from the earth itself, their walls warm in the Italian sun, their windows looking out over valleys where morning mist gathered like gathered prayers. In one such place, on the night of April 15th, 1452, a woman named Caterina gave birth to a son. We know almost nothing about her beyond this single world-changing fact. History, written by and for the powerful, rarely bothers to record the names and stories of peasant women. But in that moment, as she held her newborn child, she could not have known that she had brought into the world a mind that would illuminate human understanding like a star appearing in darkness. The father was Ser Piero da Vinci, a notary, a man of the emerging professional class that was becoming essential to the commercial life of Italy. Notaries drew up contracts, witnessed agreements, kept records, served as the living memory of business transactions in a world where literacy was rare and trust was everything. They were respectable men, necessary men, but not noble, not powerful in the way that princes and bishops were powerful. The circumstances of Leonardo's birth marked him immediately as different. He was illegitimate, born outside the bonds of marriage that gave children their place in society. In the rigid hierarchies of the 15th century, this mattered enormously. It meant he could not inherit his father's profession, could not follow the path that had been laid down for the Da Vinci family for generations. The doors that would have opened naturally to a legitimate son remained closed to him. But oh, the windows that opened instead. Freed from the expectations that would have constrained a legitimate heir, young Leonardo was able to follow his curiosity wherever it led. And it led him everywhere. The countryside around Vinci became his first school, and he proved to be an extraordinarily attentive student. He watched how water flowed in streams, noting the patterns of turbulence around rocks. He observed how birds flew, how their wings caught the air and shaped it to their purposes. He studied the way light fell through leaves, creating patterns of brightness and shadow that seemed to follow mathematical laws he could sense but not yet articulate. The child who wandered these hills was beautiful in a way that made people stop and stare. Contemporary accounts described Leonardo as almost otherworldly in his physical presence, tall and graceful with flowing hair and eyes that seemed to see through surfaces to the structures beneath. This beauty would open doors throughout his life, attracting the attention of powerful patrons who might otherwise have overlooked a bastard from a provincial town. But it was his mind, more than his face, that truly set him apart. He drew constantly, filling whatever surfaces he could find with sketches and observations. He asked questions that adults found difficult to answer. Why is the sky blue? How do muscles move bones? What makes some stones heavy and others light? The world was full of mysteries, and young Leonardo approached each one with a combination of wonder and determination that would characterize his entire life. His grandfather Antonio kept family records, and in these ledgers we catch glimpses of the boy Leonardo. Notes about his education, mentions of his mathematical abilities, references to his endless sketching. The picture that emerges is of a child who was clearly extraordinary, who possessed gifts that his family recognized, even if they didn't quite know what to do with them. As Leonardo grew through childhood into adolescence, his father Ser Piero faced an important decision. The boy could not become a notary, but he clearly had talents that shouldn't be wasted. The question was how to channel this restless intelligence, this gift for observation and representation, into something that could provide a livelihood. The answer, when it came, would shape not just Leonardo's life, but the entire future of Western art. Florence in the 1460s was experiencing a cultural explosion that historians would later call the Renaissance. The Medici family, bankers who had become the de facto rulers of the city, were pouring their wealth into artistic patronage on a scale not seen since ancient Rome. The city was filled with workshops where painters, sculptors, goldsmiths, and engineers competed to create works that would astound the world and glorify their patrons. Ser Piero decided that his talented bastard son should be apprenticed to one of these workshops. The master he chose was Andrea del Verrocchio, whose bottega was among the most prestigious in Florence. Verrocchio was not just a painter, but a complete Renaissance artist, working in bronze, marble, wood, and pigments, creating everything from massive public sculptures to delicate religious paintings, from festival decorations to engineering projects. When Leonardo arrived at Verrocchio's workshop around 1466, at the age of 14, he entered a world that would shape everything he would become. This was not a quiet studio where individual artists worked in solitary contemplation. This was a busy, noisy, collaborative environment where multiple projects proceeded simultaneously, where apprentices learned by doing the hard physical work that underpinned artistic creation. The bottega system was ancient, dating back to medieval guild traditions. Young boys would be apprenticed to a master, and they would start at the very bottom, grinding pigments, preparing wooden panels, cleaning brushes, running errands. Only gradually, as they proved their abilities, would they be allowed to contribute to actual commissions. The process could take years, even decades, before an apprentice was ready to become a master in his own right. But Leonardo was different. His skills developed with astonishing speed. His hand was already remarkably sure, his eye already trained by years of observing the natural world around Vinci. Within months, Verrocchio recognized that he had acquired an apprentice of unusual, perhaps unprecedented talent. The workshop buzzed with creative energy and fierce competition. Leonardo's fellow apprentices included some of the most gifted young artists in Florence. Sandro Botticelli, who would go on to paint some of the most beloved images in Western art, was there. Pietro Perugino, who would later teach Raphael, worked alongside Leonardo. The concentration of talent in this single workshop was extraordinary, a testament to Verrocchio's reputation and to the creative fever that gripped Florence during these years. Among these talented young men, Leonardo stood out. He brought to his work a different kind of intelligence, a questioning approach that went beyond mere technical skill. Where others might copy what they saw, Leonardo wanted to understand why things appeared as they did. He studied the mechanics of vision itself, exploring how light behaved, how distance affected perception, how the eye translated the three-dimensional world into the two-dimensional image that the brain processed. These investigations led him to develop techniques that would revolutionize painting. He began to understand atmospheric perspective, the way distant objects appear hazier and bluer than near ones. He studied the behavior of shadows, recognizing that they weren't simply dark versions of local colors, but had their own optical properties. He explored how to create the illusion of three-dimensional form on a flat surface through careful gradation of tones. Verrocchio, despite his own considerable skills, quickly recognized that his young apprentice was developing capabilities that exceeded his own. The moment of recognition came with a commission for a painting called The Baptism of Christ, intended for a monastery. Verrocchio designed the composition and painted most of the figures himself, but he allowed Leonardo to contribute an angel in the lower left corner. When the work was completed, that single angel revealed a level of artistic achievement that surpassed everything else in the painting. The figure possessed a grace, a psychological depth, a technical perfection that announced the arrival of a new kind of artist. The angel seemed to exist in a different reality than the other figures, painted with a subtlety and sophistication that made the rest of the composition look crude by comparison. Legend says that when Verrocchio saw what his apprentice had accomplished, he put down his brushes and never painted again, recognizing that he had been surpassed. The story is probably apocryphal, exaggerated in the retelling over centuries, but it captures something true about the relationship between master and student. Leonardo was not simply learning Verrocchio's techniques. He was transcending them, developing approaches to art that would fundamentally change what painting could achieve. By 1472, at the age of 20, Leonardo had been accepted into the Painters' Guild of Florence, the Compagnia di San Luca. This marked his official transition from apprentice to master, qualified to take commissions and establish his own workshop. For most young artists, this would have been the moment to set up shop and begin the steady work of building a reputation and a client base. But Leonardo was already showing signs of the restless genius that would define his entire career. He was incapable of viewing art as simply a profession to be practiced and perfected. Instead, he saw it as a means of investigating the deepest mysteries of existence, a way of understanding how the world worked and what it meant to be human. The Florence of Leonardo's youth provided the perfect environment for such ambitious thinking. Under Medici patronage, the city had become a center of humanist learning, where scholars were rediscovering ancient Greek and Roman texts and attempting to synthesize classical wisdom with Christian theology. Artists were no longer seen as mere craftsmen, but as intellectual figures capable of contributing to humanity's understanding of itself and the cosmos. This elevation of the artist's status created new opportunities, but also new pressures. Patrons expected not just technical skill, but evidence of learning, creativity, and intellectual sophistication. Artists competed not just with each other, but with poets, philosophers, and scientists for the attention and support of wealthy and powerful sponsors. In this environment, Leonardo's combination of artistic genius and scientific curiosity made him uniquely valuable. His mind ranged across every field of knowledge with an ease that astonished his contemporaries. He studied mathematics and geometry, not just for their practical applications to perspective and proportion, but for their own inherent beauty and logical perfection. He investigated anatomy, not just to improve his ability to paint human figures, but to understand the fundamental processes of life itself. Yet even as he established himself as one of Florence's most promising young artists, Leonardo was displaying characteristics that would both elevate and complicate his career. He had an almost compulsive need to understand how things worked, leading him to spend enormous amounts of time on research and experimentation that had no immediate practical application. He struggled to complete projects, often abandoning paintings when they no longer held his interest or when new challenges captured his attention. These tendencies were already visible in his earliest independent works. His paintings from this period show technical mastery and innovative approaches to composition and light, but they also reveal an artist more interested in solving problems than in simply creating beautiful objects. Every element seems to have been approached as a separate challenge to be overcome through study and experimentation. As Leonardo moved through his 20s, his reputation in Florence continued to grow, but so did his reputation for eccentricity and unreliability. Patrons wanted his genius, but they also wanted finished works delivered on schedule. Leonardo wanted to push the boundaries of what art could achieve, to use painting as a means of scientific investigation and philosophical reflection. These conflicting desires created tensions that would recur throughout his life. The stage was being set for a career unlike any other in the history of art or science. A journey that would take Leonardo from the workshops of Florence to the courts of Milan, Rome, and France, always searching for the perfect synthesis of art, science, and understanding that seemed to hover just beyond his grasp, always tantalizingly close but never quite attainable. Chapter 1. The Florentine Years and Early Mastery. The late 1470s in Florence were years of both creative flowering and underlying tension for the young Leonardo. The city that had nurtured his genius was also a place of violence, political intrigue, and rigid social hierarchies that could destroy a reputation overnight. It was in this atmosphere of brilliant achievement and lurking danger that Leonardo would face his first serious crisis, one that would shape his relationship with authority and society for the rest of his life. The year 1476 brought an accusation that could have ended Leonardo's career before it truly began. An anonymous denunciation accused him of sodomy, a crime that carried severe penalties in Renaissance Florence, including public humiliation, heavy fines, exile, or even death. Several other young men were named alongside Leonardo including members of prominent Florentine families, suggesting that the charges were politically motivated, part of the complex web of rivalries and vendettas that characterized life in the Republic. For months, Leonardo lived under this shadow, unable to secure new commissions, his reputation hanging by a thread. The legal proceedings dragged on with agonizing slowness, each day bringing new uncertainty about his future. The experience marked him profoundly, instilling a wariness of public exposure and a preference for the protection of powerful patrons that would characterize the rest of his life. Eventually, the charges were dropped for lack of evidence, but the damage to Leonardo's sense of security was permanent. He became more guarded in his personal life, more careful about his associations, more dependent on the goodwill of those who could shield him from enemies. The crisis also deepened his natural tendency toward secrecy, leading him to develop the mirror writing that would make his notebooks so difficult for others to read, a private language for private thoughts. The aftermath of this ordeal coincided with a period of intense artistic development. Around 1478, Leonardo received a commission for what would become one of his most important early works, the Adoration of the Magi, intended for the monastery of San Donato Escopido. Though he would never complete it, the painting reveals the full emergence of Leonardo's revolutionary approach to composition and psychological depth. Where traditional treatments of this biblical subject arranged figures in static, hierarchical compositions, Leonardo created a dynamic spiral of movement that drew the viewer's eye inexorably toward the central figures of Mary and the infant Christ. Every gesture, every expression, every detail of costume and setting was calculated to contribute to the overall emotional impact of the scene. The painting was conceived not just as a religious image, but as a psychological drama that would engage viewers on multiple levels. The preparatory drawings for the Adoration reveal the extraordinary depth of Leonardo's research and planning. He studied horses in motion to perfect the rearing steeds in the background. He analyzed facial expressions to capture the full range of human responses to divine revelation. He explored architectural elements that would create the proper sense of space and grandeur. Each aspect of the painting became an opportunity for scientific investigation and artistic innovation. But as with so many of Leonardo's projects, the Adoration remained unfinished. As he worked on the complex composition, new challenges and opportunities began to pull his attention in different directions. His notebooks from this period reveal a mind expanding beyond the boundaries of painting to encompass engineering, anatomy, mathematics, and natural philosophy. He was becoming less a painter who dabbled in other subjects, and more a universal genius for whom painting was just one means of understanding the world. This intellectual restlessness was both Leonardo's greatest strength and his most serious weakness. While other artists focused on perfecting their craft within established traditions, Leonardo was constantly pushing into uncharted territory, developing new techniques and asking questions that had never been asked before. The results were often breathtaking, but the process was slow and frequently frustrating for patrons who simply wanted finished works. The political situation in Florence during these years also created an atmosphere that was increasingly uncomfortable for someone of Leonardo's temperament. The Pazzi conspiracy of 1478, in which members of a rival banking family attempted to assassinate Lorenzo de' Medici during Mass at the cathedral, left the city on edge. The failed plot resulted in brutal reprisals, with conspirators hanged from the windows of the Palazzo della Signoria and their supporters hunted down throughout the city. Leonardo was commissioned to paint portraits of the executed conspirators on the exterior walls of the Bargello prison. These images, designed to serve as warnings to future plotters, required him to study the faces of dead men and capture their likenesses in a way that would both identify them and demonstrate the consequences of treason. The work was macabre, but it also provided Leonardo with opportunities to study human anatomy and facial structure that would prove invaluable in his later artistic development. The experience of painting the dead conspirators seems to have crystallized Leonardo's growing disenchantment with Florence. The city that had nurtured his genius was also a place of violence, suspicion, and petty rivalries that increasingly seemed to constrain rather than inspire his work. He began to look beyond the walls of Florence, imagining possibilities that might exist in other courts, other cities, other centers of power and learning. During this period of restlessness and searching, Leonardo began to develop the persona that would define his later career. He cultivated an image of himself as more than just an artist, presenting himself as a master of multiple disciplines who could serve patrons not just as a painter, but as an engineer, inventor, military advisor, and court entertainer. This was a radical departure from traditional artistic practice, where painters were expected to remain within clearly defined professional boundaries. The transformation was gradual but decisive. His notebooks from the early 1480s show him grappling with problems of hydraulic engineering, studying the flight of birds, designing mechanical devices, and exploring mathematical principles that had applications far beyond the visual arts. He was creating for himself a new kind of professional identity, one that would allow him to pursue knowledge wherever it might lead. This evolution was perfectly timed to coincide with changes in how Renaissance courts operated and what they expected from the artists and intellectuals they supported. The old model, in which painters were essentially skilled craftsmen who worked on specific commissions, was giving way to a new system in which artists were valued, as much for their intellectual capabilities as for their technical skills. Courts wanted figures who could enhance their prestige through their very presence, men whose reputation for learning and creativity would reflect well on their patrons. Leonardo understood these changing dynamics better than most of his contemporaries, and he began to position himself accordingly. He studied not just art and engineering, but also music, literature, and natural philosophy, developing the kind of broad cultural knowledge that would make him a valuable addition to any sophisticated court. He also cultivated the personal qualities that would appeal to aristocratic patrons, developing an elegance of manner and conversation that matched his physical beauty and intellectual gifts. Contemporary accounts describe him as charming and gracious, able to move easily in the highest social circles, despite his illegitimate birth and artisan background. By 1482, Leonardo had made a decision that would shape the next phase of his career. Florence, for all its artistic achievements, was becoming too small for his expanding ambitions. The city's republican government, while supportive of the arts, could not offer the kind of sustained patronage that would allow him to pursue his most ambitious projects. What he needed was a powerful prince who could provide not just financial support, but also access to the resources and personnel necessary for large-scale engineering and artistic undertakings. His attention turned northward to Milan, one of the most powerful and wealthy city-states in northern Italy. The Duke of Milan, Ludovico Sforza, known as Il Moro for his dark complexion and cunning nature, was building one of the most brilliant courts in Europe, attracting scholars, artists, and inventors from across the continent. Milan was also a center of military innovation, constantly developing new weapons and fortifications to maintain its position in the complex web of Italian politics. For someone of Leonardo's interests and ambitions, Milan seemed like an ideal destination. The letter that Leonardo wrote to Ludovico, seeking employment, reveals both his strategic intelligence and his understanding of what patrons really wanted. Rather than emphasizing his artistic achievements, he presented himself primarily as a military engineer, listing 10 different areas in which he could serve the Duke's military needs, from designing portable bridges to creating new types of siege weapons. Only at the end of the letter did he mention, almost as an afterthought, that he could also paint. This approach showed Leonardo's shrewd understanding of Renaissance political realities. While courts appreciated artistic beauty, what they needed most urgently were practical advantages in the constant struggle for survival and expansion that characterized Italian politics. By positioning himself as someone who could contribute to Ludovico's military capabilities, Leonardo was offering something far more valuable than mere decoration. The strategy worked. In 1482, at the age of 30, Leonardo left Florence for Milan, beginning a new chapter that would see him develop from a promising young artist into one of the most celebrated figures of the Renaissance. The move represented more than just a change of residence. It was a transformation of identity, from a Florentine painter to an international genius whose reputation would eventually span continents and centuries. As Leonardo traveled north through the Tuscan countryside and into Lombardy, he was leaving behind the city of his youth and artistic training, but he was also leaving behind the constraints and expectations that had made Florence increasingly uncomfortable. The road ahead led toward a court that promised the resources, the freedom, and the appreciation necessary for his genius to flourish. The Milan that awaited him was a city unlike any he had experienced. Where Florence hummed with the energy of merchants and republican politics, Milan pulsed with the rhythm of absolute power. The Sforza court was a glittering machine designed to project strength and sophistication, and Leonardo would find himself at the center of a world where artistic achievement served political ambition on a scale he had never imagined. Chapter 2. The Milan Court and Maturity. The Milan that Leonardo entered in 1482 was a city transformed by power and ambition. The Castello Sforzesco rose above the city like a mountain of brick and stone, a fortress that had been reimagined as a palace of unprecedented luxury. Its halls were filled with the finest artworks Europe could produce, its libraries stocked with rare manuscripts copied by the most skilled scribes, its chambers designed to impress visiting dignitaries with the refinement and might of Milanese civilization. Ludovico Sforza was not yet the official Duke of Milan. He ruled as regent for his young nephew Gian Galazzo, but everyone understood that real power rested in his hands. Ludovico was a man of immense culture and equally immense ambition, determined to transform Milan into a rival to Florence and Venice while securing his own position against the numerous enemies who questioned his right to rule. The court that welcomed Leonardo was a carefully orchestrated spectacle of wealth and learning. Nobles competed to display their erudition and taste. Scholars debated points of philosophy and theology. Artists created works that would enhance the glory of the Sforza name. Into this environment of creativity and competition came Leonardo, 30 years old and ready to prove that he was more than just another talented painter. Leonardo's first years in Milan were a period of careful positioning and gradual recognition. Unlike Florence, where his reputation had preceded him, Milan required him to demonstrate his worth in an environment where competition was fierce. The court was filled with ambitious men from across Europe, each seeking to advance their fortunes through service to Ludovico. The artist quickly demonstrated his versatility through a series of smaller commissions that showcased his range of talents. He designed sets for court entertainments, elaborate theatrical productions that combined music, dance, and spectacular visual effects. He created portraits of court ladies, capturing not just their physical beauty, but something of their inner character. He began work on engineering projects that would enhance Milan's military capabilities and commercial infrastructure. Each success brought him closer to the inner circle of power. Gradually, Ludovico began to recognize that he had acquired not just another talented artist, but a genius whose capabilities extended far beyond conventional categories. The commission that would truly establish Leonardo's reputation in Milan came in the form of an equestrian monument to Francesco Sforza, Ludovico's father and the founder of the Sforza dynasty. This was to be no ordinary statue, but a bronze colossus larger than any sculpture created since ancient times, a monument that would proclaim Sforza power and legitimacy to the world. The technical challenges involved in creating such a massive bronze casting were staggering, requiring innovations in metallurgy, engineering, and artistic technique that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible. Leonardo approached the project with characteristic thoroughness, filling notebook after notebook with studies. He examined horses in every possible state and position, observing them at rest and in motion, walking and galloping, calm and agitated. He dissected dead horses to understand the structure of muscles and bones beneath the skin. He made mathematical calculations to determine the precise proportions that would create an impression of power and grace. The preparatory work transformed what might have been a conventional commemorative sculpture into a groundbreaking investigation of art, science, and engineering. The scale of the project required Leonardo to master entirely new skills. The bronze required for the casting would weigh more than 70 tons, necessitating the construction of specialized furnaces and the development of new methods for controlling the flow of molten metal. The supporting structure had to be engineered with mathematical precision to prevent collapse. The artistic conception demanded a level of dynamic movement that had never been attempted in sculpture of this size. As work on the horse progressed, Leonardo's reputation spread throughout Italy and beyond. The project became a symbol of Milan's ambition and technological superiority, with visitors traveling from across Europe to witness the creation of what promised to be the eighth wonder of the world. The clay model, when finally completed, stood nearly 24 feet high and was universally acclaimed as a masterpiece of both artistic vision and technical achievement. Artists came to study it, to marvel at how Leonardo had captured the essential nature of equine power and grace. Engineers examined the supporting structure, trying to understand how such a massive form could be held aloft without visible strain. But the horse also revealed the limitations that would plague many of Leonardo's greatest projects. The sheer complexity of the undertaking meant that progress was slow and expensive, requiring sustained support from Ludovico over many years. As political pressures mounted and military threats intensified, the resources required for the bronze casting became increasingly difficult to justify. The 70 tons of bronze that had been allocated for the sculpture were eventually redirected to the more immediate need of manufacturing cannons for Milan's defense. The fate of the horse became symbolic of the precarious balance between artistic ambition and political reality that characterized Leonardo's entire career in Milan. While he enjoyed unprecedented freedom to pursue his interests and develop his ideas, he was also dependent on the continued favor of a patron whose own position was far from secure. The sophisticated court culture that nurtured his genius was built on foundations that could shift dramatically with changes in political fortune. During these same years, Leonardo was pursuing painting commissions that would establish his reputation as the greatest artist of his generation. The Virgin of the Rocks, painted for the confraternity of the Immaculate Conception, revealed the full maturation of his revolutionary approach to painting. The work demonstrated his mastery of sfumato, the subtle gradation of tones and colors that created an almost magical sense of depth and atmosphere. The technique involved building up multiple translucent layers of paint, each one so thin as to be almost invisible, yet collectively creating effects of light and shadow that seemed to glow from within the canvas. The painting was unlike anything that had been seen before in Italian art, where traditional religious paintings relied on clear outlines and bright colors to convey their messages. Leonardo created a mysterious twilight world where forms emerged from shadow through almost imperceptible gradations of light and dark. The technique required an understanding of optics and atmospheric perspective that went far beyond conventional artistic training. The psychological depth of the Virgin of the Rocks was equally revolutionary. Each figure was conceived not as a symbolic representation, but as a complex individual with their own interior life and emotional reality. The Virgin's protective gesture toward the infant Christ, the angel's knowing smile, the young John the Baptist's gesture of recognition, all contributed to a narrative that unfolded through subtle visual cues rather than obvious symbolic devices. This approach to painting as psychological drama would reach its ultimate expression in the work that many consider Leonardo's greatest achievement, The Last Supper. Commissioned for the refectory of the convent of Santa Maria del Grazie, this fresco was intended to serve as a devotional image for the Dominican friars who gathered there for their meals.
What Leonardo created instead was a revolutionary exploration of human psychology under extreme stress. a work that transformed a familiar religious subject into a timeless meditation on betrayal, loyalty, and the complexity of human nature. The moment depicted was the instant when Christ announces to his disciples that one of them will betray him, and Leonardo captured the shockwave of emotion that ripples through the group. The technical innovations required for the Last Supper were as groundbreaking as its artistic conception. Traditional fresco technique required artists to work quickly while the plaster was still wet. Making careful planning and detailed execution difficult, Leonardo instead developed an experimental technique that allowed him to work more slowly and deliberately, building up layers of paint with the precision and subtlety that his vision required. The composition itself was a masterpiece of mathematical precision and psychological insight. The 12 apostles were arranged in 4 groups of 3, each group representing a different emotional response to Christ's announcement. The perspective lines all converged on Christ's head, creating a visual focus that reinforced the narrative centrality of his revelation. Every detail of the painting was calculated to contribute to its overall impact. The positioning of hands, the direction of gazes, the arrangement of drapery, the placement of objects on the table, all served to guide the viewer's attention and enhance the dramatic tension of the scene. The result was a work that functioned simultaneously as religious art, psychological drama, and technical tour de force. But even as Leonardo was creating these masterpieces, his restless intelligence was pulling him in new directions. His notebooks from the Milan period reveal a mind that was systematically investigating every aspect of the natural world. From the flight of birds to the flow of water, from human anatomy to mechanical engineering, from optics to acoustics, the court of Ludovico Sforza provided the perfect environment for this intellectual expansion. Unlike the commercial workshops of Florence, where time was money and efficiency was paramount, the Milan court valued learning for its own sake and was willing to support investigations that had no immediate practical application. Leonardo was able to pursue questions simply because they fascinated him, developing a body of scientific observation and theoretical speculation that would not be equaled for centuries. His anatomical studies during this period were particularly groundbreaking. Working with physicians at local hospitals, he performed dissections on human corpses, creating detailed drawings that revealed the structure and function of internal organs with unprecedented accuracy. These studies went far beyond the needs of artistic representation. Leonardo was conducting genuine scientific research that advanced human understanding of physiology and anatomy. His drawings of the human heart showed its chambers and valves with remarkable precision. His studies of the nervous system traced the pathways of sensation and movement through the body. His investigations of the reproductive system revealed structures that wouldn't be confirmed until the invention of the microscope. The mechanical inventions that filled his notebooks during these years were equally remarkable. Leonardo designed flying machines based on his observations of bird flight, military engines that could revolutionize siege warfare, hydraulic systems that could transform agriculture and urban planning. While many of these designs were too advanced for the technology of his time, they demonstrated an understanding of mechanical principles that would not be fully appreciated until the modern era. This explosion of creative and intellectual activity established Leonardo as far more than just an artist in the eyes of his contemporaries. He became a symbol of human potential itself, a figure who seemed to embody the Renaissance belief that individual genius could transcend traditional limitations and achieve something approaching divine knowledge. The court of Milan, under his influence, became a center of innovation and learning that attracted scholars and artists from across Europe. Yet even as Leonardo reached the height of his powers, the political foundations of his success were beginning to crumble. The complex web of alliances that maintained the balance of power in Italy was shifting, and the French were casting covetous eyes on the wealthy Italian city-states. Ludovico Sforza, for all his cultural achievements and political cunning, was about to face challenges that would test not only his rule but the entire world that had nurtured Leonardo's genius. The storm that would destroy this golden age was gathering beyond the Alps, and when it broke, it would sweep away everything Leonardo had built during his 17 years in Milan. Chapter 3. Upheaval and Wandering. The year 1499 brought catastrophic change to Milan, and with it, the end of the most productive and stable period of Leonardo's career. The French King Louis XII had pressed his claim to the Duchy of Milan, and Ludovico Sforza's carefully constructed political alliances crumbled as former friends either fled or switched sides. In September, French forces crossed the Alps, and advanced on Milan with efficiency that shocked the Italian political establishment. For Leonardo, absorbed in his scientific investigations and artistic projects, the approaching crisis must have seemed like distant thunder, ominous but not immediately threatening. He had spent 17 years building his reputation and position in Milan, creating a life that allowed him unprecedented freedom to pursue his diverse interests. The Sforza court had become not just his workplace, but his intellectual home. The collapse when it came was swift and devastating. On October 6, 1499, King Louis XII entered Milan in triumph, ending the Sforza dynasty. The magnificent court that had been Leonardo's world simply ceased to exist overnight. Courtiers scattered to find new patrons. Servants fled with whatever valuables they could carry. The great palace emptied as if struck by plague. Leonardo faced a crisis that went beyond the loss of employment. At 47 years old, he was no longer a promising young artist who could easily find new opportunities. His reputation was enormous, but it was also complex. He was known as much for his unfinished projects as for his completed masterpieces, and his scientific interests often seemed to distract him from practical tasks. The immediate danger was even more pressing. The French occupation was accompanied by widespread looting as soldiers seized whatever they could find. Leonardo's workshop, filled with years of accumulated drawings, models, and experimental apparatus, was particularly vulnerable. The great clay model of the horse became a target for French archers who used it for target practice, until it was reduced to fragments. In the chaos of those final weeks in Milan, Leonardo managed to salvage what he could of his life's work. He gathered his most precious notebooks, rolled up his drawings, and prepared for another exile. The mathematical calculations, anatomical studies, and engineering designs that filled his notebooks represented decades of investigation and discovery, intellectual treasures that were irreplaceable and infinitely portable. The journey south from Milan in late 1499 must have been filled with uncertainty and regret. Leonardo was accompanied by his longtime companion Salai, a young man of dubious reputation but undeniable beauty who had entered his household as a boy. Also traveling with them was Luca Pasolli, the brilliant mathematician whose work on proportion and geometry had deeply influenced Leonardo's thinking. Their destination was Venice, where Leonardo hoped to find temporary refuge and perhaps new opportunities. The Venetian Republic, with its vast commercial empire and tradition of hiring foreign experts for military and engineering projects, seemed like a logical place for someone of his talents. Venice was also one of the few Italian states with both the resources and the independence to resist French expansion. The Venice that welcomed Leonardo in December 1499 was a city unlike any other in Europe. A maritime empire built on trade and maintained through diplomatic cunning and naval power. The city's unique form of government balanced aristocratic privilege with republican institutions, producing a stability that had endured for centuries. But Venice also presented challenges. The city's pragmatic merchant culture was less interested in pure intellectual speculation than the courtly environment Leonardo had left behind. Venetian patrons wanted results that could enhance their commercial or military advantages, and they were less willing to support the kind of open-ended research that had flourished under Ludovico's patronage. The commission that the Venetian Senate offered Leonardo reflected these practical priorities. They wanted him to design defensive systems that could protect their territories from advancing French forces. This was exactly the kind of military engineering work that Leonardo had promised in his letter to Ludovico 20 years earlier. Leonardo's response was characteristically innovative and ambitious. Rather than simply strengthening existing fortifications, he proposed a radical solution that would use natural geography to create an impregnable barrier. His plan called for a series of dams and canals that would allow the Venetians to flood the entire Isonzo Valley, creating an impassable water barrier between French forces and Venetian territory. The engineering challenges were staggering, requiring precise calculations about water flow, soil composition, and structural engineering that pushed the boundaries of contemporary knowledge. Leonardo threw himself into the work with characteristic intensity, producing detailed drawings and mathematical analyses that demonstrated both the feasibility and potential effectiveness of his proposal. But the flooding project, despite its technical brilliance, was ultimately rejected by the Senate as too expensive and too risky. Venetian military engineers, while acknowledging the innovation of Leonardo's approach, were skeptical about its practicality. The Republic's traditional reliance on naval power and diplomatic maneuvering seemed more reliable than radical new schemes. By the spring of 1500, Leonardo was already looking beyond Venice for new opportunities. Letters and rumors from across Italy brought news of potential patrons and promising situations. The French occupation of Milan had disrupted the entire Italian political system, creating both dangers and opportunities as various powers struggled to adapt to the new reality. One possibility that seemed particularly promising was a return to Florence, the city where Leonardo's career had begun nearly 30 years earlier. The Florentine Republic had recently undergone its own political transformation, overthrowing the Medici and establishing a new government. This Republican regime was actively seeking to enhance its prestige by attracting prominent artists and intellectuals. The Florence that Leonardo entered in April 1500 was dramatically different from the city he had left. 18 years earlier, the confident merchant republic of his youth had been replaced by a more austere and uncertain state. The magnificent court culture that had flourished under Lorenzo de' Medici was gone, replaced by a sober republican government that viewed artistic luxury with suspicion while still recognizing the value of cultural prestige. The brief but intense influence of Girolamo Savonarola, the Dominican friar who had dominated the city during the 1490s, had left lasting marks on Florentine culture. Savonarola's condemnation of worldly vanity and his calls for moral purification had led to the famous bonfires of the Vanities, where citizens voluntarily destroyed paintings, books, and other objects deemed spiritually dangerous. Though Savonarola himself had been executed in 1498, his influence lingered in a more austere public culture. The new Florentine government, led by Piero Soderini, was committed to democratic principles and civic virtue, but it also recognized that cultural achievement could enhance the Republic's reputation. For Leonardo, this new Florence presented both opportunities and challenges. His reputation as one of the greatest artists of the age preceded him, but so did his association with the kind of courtly culture that the Republic had rejected. The question of how to position himself within this transformed landscape required careful navigation. The commission that would define Leonardo's second Florentine period came from an unexpected source. The Servite friars of the Annunziata, seeking a prestigious altarpiece for their church, approached him with an offer that included housing and support for his entire household. Leonardo's response demonstrated both his continued artistic evolution and his growing reputation as a figure, whose very presence enhanced prestige. Rather than simply delivering a conventional religious painting, he created a cartoon, a full-scale preparatory drawing, that became a sensation in its own right. The work depicted the Virgin Mary seated on the lap of her mother, Saint Anne, with the infant Christ reaching toward a lamb. The psychological complexity and technical innovation of this cartoon were immediately recognized by contemporary viewers. When the cartoon was displayed publicly, it drew crowds of admirers who came not just to see a beautiful drawing, but to witness what seemed like a new form of artistic achievement. The public response revealed something important about Leonardo's evolving reputation. He was no longer seen merely as a skilled painter, but as a kind of cultural phenomenon, whose work transcended conventional categories. This elevation of status brought new kinds of opportunities. The Florentine government began to consider him for projects that would enhance the Republic's prestige. The most ambitious would prove to be one of the greatest challenges of Leonardo's career, testing not only his artistic abilities, but also his capacity to work within the constraints of Republican politics and public accountability. The commission came in the form of a massive fresco for the walls of the newly constructed Palazzo Vecchio. The subject was the Battle of Anghiari, Florentine victory over Milanese forces in 1440. The irony of asking Leonardo, who had spent 17 years serving Milan, to celebrate a Florentine triumph over his former patrons was not lost on anyone. The scale of the project was staggering. The wall designated for the fresco measured nearly 60 feet in length and 20 feet in height, creating a surface area that dwarfed anything Leonardo had previously attempted. The technical challenges were equally formidable, requiring him to develop new methods for transferring his design to the wall. Leonardo approached the project with characteristic thoroughness. His preparatory studies reveal an artist grappling not just with the logistics of large-scale painting, but with fundamental questions about how art could capture the reality of warfare and violence. The central scene focused on the struggle for a battle standard, with mounted warriors locked in desperate combat while their horses reared and bit at each other with almost human fury. But the Battle of Anghiari would also become a testament to Leonardo's ongoing struggles with practical demands. His experimental approach to fresco technique, designed to allow for subtle gradations of tone and color, proved problematic when applied to such a vast surface. The paint began to deteriorate almost immediately, forcing him to abandon sections and experiment with different approaches.
The frustrations were compounded by the presence of another artistic genius commissioned to paint the opposite wall. Michelangelo Buonarroti, 23 years younger than Leonardo, and already recognized as a sculptor of extraordinary ability, had been assigned the task of depicting the Battle of Cascina, another Florentine military victory. The contrast between the two artists could hardly have been more dramatic. Where Leonardo was elegant and courtly, Michelangelo was rough and passionate. Where Leonardo emphasized scientific observation, Michelangelo relied on raw emotional power. Their different temperaments represented competing visions of what Renaissance art could achieve. The competition became one of the great spectacles of Renaissance Florence. Citizens visited the Palazzo Vecchio to observe both artists at work, comparing techniques and debating the relative merits of their approaches. The rivalry pushed both men to their limits, forcing them to justify their methods before the most demanding audience imaginable. For Leonardo, the pressure of this very public competition was complicated by his growing awareness that his interests were diverging from expectations. While Florence wanted him to complete the Battle of Anghiari, his own intellectual curiosity was pulling him towards scientific investigations that seemed increasingly incompatible with the demands of artistic production. His notebooks from this period reveal a mind systematically exploring every aspect of the natural world with intensity that bordered on obsession. His anatomical studies, resumed with the cooperation of Florentine physicians, were producing insights that went far beyond anything required for artistic purposes. He was dissecting corpses not to improve his painting, but to understand the fundamental processes of life itself. The flying machines that filled page after page represented another area where investigations had moved beyond practical application toward pure speculation. His observations of bird flight, conducted with mathematical precision, were generating theoretical insights about aerodynamics that would not be fully understood for centuries. The tension between Leonardo's expanding scientific interests and his obligations as an artist created a crisis that would define the remainder of his career. The Battle of Anghiari remained unfinished, its deteriorating surface a visible reminder of the gap between ambition and achievement. The failure damaged Leonardo's reputation in Florence and raised questions about his reliability. Yet even as his standing became precarious, his reputation elsewhere was reaching new heights. His notebooks were circulating among scholars across Europe, establishing him as one of the leading natural philosophers of his age. His anatomical drawings were being copied by physicians who recognized their scientific value. The portrait he painted during these years would become perhaps his most famous work. The subject was Lisa Gardini, the wife of a wealthy Florentine silk merchant. The commission itself was modest, a portrait for the family's private collection. What Leonardo created transcended conventional boundaries to become something unprecedented in Western art. The woman known to history as the Mona Lisa embodied all of Leonardo's theoretical insights about human psychology, optical science, and artistic technique. Her enigmatic expression, created through subtle application of sfumato, seemed to change depending on the viewer's perspective and emotional state. The technical innovations represented the culmination of decades of scientific investigation, translated into artistic practice. Leonardo's understanding of atmospheric perspective allowed him to create a landscape background of unprecedented depth and realism. His knowledge of human anatomy informed every aspect of the figure's construction. But the Mona Lisa was also significant for what it revealed about Leonardo's changing relationship with his art. Unlike earlier works created for specific purposes, this portrait seemed to exist primarily as an opportunity for Leonardo to explore his own interests. He worked on it slowly and obsessively, carrying it with him as he traveled and continuing to refine details long after any reasonable patron would have considered it complete. As Leonardo's reputation for unreliability grew, so did his value as a cultural symbol. Powerful patrons across Europe began to compete for his services, not because they expected him to complete specific projects on schedule, but because his presence would enhance their prestige and demonstrate their sophistication. This transformation created new opportunities, but also new pressures. Courts that invited him as a painter found themselves hosting a natural philosopher whose interests ranged across every conceivable field of knowledge. His anatomical dissections, engineering experiments, and mathematical investigations all required resources beyond what traditional artistic patronage provided. The French, who had observed Leonardo's genius during their occupation of Milan, were particularly eager to secure his services. King Louis XII, having consolidated control over northern Italy, was looking for ways to demonstrate that French rule could support the same kind of cultural achievement that had made Italian courts famous. The invitation that would eventually draw Leonardo away from Florence came from Charles d'Amboise, the French governor of Milan. D'Amboise offered not just employment, but a return to the kind of environment where Leonardo's diverse interests could flourish without constraints imposed by Republican politics. By 1506, Leonardo had made his decision. Florence could no longer provide the intellectual freedom and financial support his expanding interests required. The Battle of Anghiari would remain forever unfinished, but the scientific investigations that had distracted him from its completion would prove to be his most lasting contribution to human knowledge. The return to Milan in 1506 marked the beginning of Leonardo's final phase as an artist and scientist. He was 54 years old, no longer the promising young talent who had first arrived at Ludovico's court, but a figure of international reputation whose very presence could transform the cultural landscape. Chapter 4. The Scientific Mind Unleashed. The Milan that Leonardo returned to in 1506 bore little resemblance to the glittering court he had left 7 years earlier. The French occupation had transformed the city from an independent center of power into a provincial capital of a foreign empire. Yet for Leonardo, this new Milan offered something the Sforza court never had: the freedom to pursue scientific investigation without the constant pressure to produce finished artworks. Charles d'Amboise, the French governor who had secured Leonardo's return, was a cultivated nobleman who understood both the practical and symbolic value of genius. By bringing the most famous artist in Europe back to Milan under French patronage, he was making a statement about the superiority of French civilization and the benefits that Italian cities could expect from accepting French rule. For Leonardo, the return to Milan offered a chance to resume investigations that had been interrupted by his departure and to work within a system that valued innovation and experimentation. The French administration, with its emphasis on military engineering and technological advancement, was particularly interested in Leonardo's mechanical inventions and his expertise in hydraulic engineering. The projects that occupied Leonardo during his second Milan period reflected both his matured interests and the practical needs of his French patrons. He was commissioned to design a series of canals that would improve navigation and irrigation throughout Lombardy, a massive undertaking that required him to survey vast areas of countryside and develop new techniques for moving earth and controlling water flow. These hydraulic projects allowed Leonardo to combine his artistic sensibility with his engineering expertise in ways that produced both practical benefits and aesthetic satisfaction. The canals he designed were not merely functional waterways, but carefully planned landscapes that enhanced the beauty of the countryside while serving commercial and agricultural purposes. His notebooks from this period show him thinking about engineering problems with the same attention to proportion and harmony that he brought to his paintings. He studied the flow of water with the eye of a poet and the mind of a mathematician, seeing in the swirls and eddies patterns that connected to larger principles governing all fluid motion. The anatomical studies that Leonardo pursued during these years represented the culmination of a lifelong fascination with the structure and function of living organisms. Working with physicians at the hospital of Santa Maria del Grazie, he was able to perform dissections on human corpses with a thoroughness and precision that had never before been attempted. His drawings of the human heart, nervous system, and reproductive organs achieved a level of accuracy that would not be surpassed for centuries. These were not merely artistic exercises, but genuine contributions to medical science. Leonardo's understanding of cardiac function, for example, included insights into the role of valves and the relationship between heart structure and blood flow that wouldn't be confirmed until the 17th century. The anatomical investigations were driven by more than scientific curiosity. Leonardo was seeking to understand the fundamental principles that govern all living things, the hidden mechanisms that connected the microcosm of human physiology with the macrocosm of the natural world. His famous drawing of the Vitruvian Man, showing the human figure inscribed within a circle and square, represented his belief that human proportions reflected the mathematical principles underlying all of creation. The scientific work that Leonardo conducted during his second Milanese period established him as one of the leading natural philosophers of his age. His studies of optics explored how light behaved, how the eye processed information, how distance affected perception. His investigations of acoustics examined the nature of sound, how it traveled through different media, how musical instruments produced their distinctive tones. His mechanical studies ranged from simple machines like levers and pulleys to complex systems of gears and linkages. He explored principles of friction, investigating how different materials affected resistance to motion. He studied the behavior of springs and elastic materials, developing theories about energy storage and release. But even as Leonardo was conducting these groundbreaking investigations, he remained an artist of extraordinary gifts. The few paintings he completed during these years showed a deepening psychological complexity and technical refinement that surpassed even his earlier masterpieces. The second version of the Virgin of the Rocks and his haunting depiction of St. John the Baptist demonstrated how scientific understanding could inform and elevate artistic expression. The St. John the Baptist, in particular, represented a new direction in Leonardo's art, one that emphasized spiritual mystery over conventional religious iconography. The saint's androgynous beauty and enigmatic gesture created an image that was simultaneously sacred and profane, challenging viewers to look beyond surface appearances toward deeper spiritual truths. The painting's dark atmospheric background and subtle modeling of form demonstrated Leonardo's mastery of chiaroscuro, the dramatic interplay of light and shadow that would influence generations of later artists. Every technical innovation visible in the work was the product of decades of scientific investigation into the behavior of light and the psychology of perception. But even as Leonardo was creating these final masterpieces, his attention was increasingly focused on theoretical investigations that had little immediate application. His studies of optics, acoustics, and mechanics were generating insights that would not be fully appreciated until the scientific revolution of the 17th century. He was developing theories about the nature of light that anticipated the wave theory of optics. His observations of water flow were laying groundwork for what would become fluid dynamics. His mechanical investigations were exploring principles that would later be formalized as the laws of motion and energy conservation. The notebooks that Leonardo filled during his second Milanese period reveal a mind systematically working toward a unified theory of natural phenomena. He saw connections everywhere, from the spiraling patterns of water flow to the branching structures of trees and blood vessels, from the flight of birds to the flow of air around obstacles. His investigations were guided by the belief that the same mathematical principles governed all natural processes, from the smallest organic functions to the largest cosmic movements. This holistic approach to knowledge made Leonardo increasingly isolated from his contemporaries, who were accustomed to more specialized forms of expertise. The isolation was both intellectual and social. Leonardo's habit of writing in mirror script and his use of coded symbols made his notebooks difficult for others to read. His tendency to leave projects unfinished created a reputation for unreliability that limited his opportunities for collaboration. The political situation in Italy during the early 16th century also contributed to Leonardo's sense of displacement. The French occupation of Milan was constantly threatened by shifting alliances and military campaigns. In 1512, these tensions erupted into open warfare that would once again disrupt Leonardo's life. A coalition of papal and Spanish forces launched a campaign to drive the French out of northern Italy. As the military situation deteriorated, French control over Milan became increasingly precarious. Charles d'Amboise, Leonardo's patron and protector, died in 1511, leaving the artist without a reliable advocate within the French administration. The end came suddenly in the summer of 1512, when French forces were finally driven out of Milan. For the second time in his career, Leonardo found himself fleeing from a collapsing political order. At 60 years old, he was too experienced to be surprised by such reversals, but too set in his ways to adapt easily to new circumstances. As Leonardo traveled south from Milan for what would prove to be the final time, he carried with him the accumulated knowledge and experience of 6 decades devoted to understanding the natural world. His notebooks contained insights that would not be equaled for generations, while his paintings represented a level of artistic achievement that had redefined what was possible in visual art. But he was also carrying the burden of unfulfilled ambitions and incomplete projects. The great bronze horse remained a pile of fragments. The Battle of Anghiari was deteriorating on the wall. Countless scientific investigations had been interrupted by the practical demands of survival in an unstable world. The road ahead would lead through the Papal States toward Rome, where a new pope with humanist sympathies was creating opportunities for artists and scholars. Pope Julius II had already demonstrated his commitment to artistic excellence by commissioning Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling and Raphael to decorate the papal apartments. But Leonardo would discover that Rome, for all its artistic opportunities and intellectual resources, presented challenges that were different from, but no less difficult than those he had faced elsewhere. Success in Rome would require not just genius, but the kind of political sophistication that Leonardo had never fully mastered. Chapter 5. The Roman Years and Gathering Twilight. The Rome that Leonardo entered in 1513 was a city intoxicated by its own magnificence. Under Pope Julius II and his successor Leo X, the Eternal City had become the epicenter of a cultural revolution that sought to rival the glories of ancient Rome. The papal court attracted the greatest artists, architects, and intellectuals of the age, all competing for commissions that would immortalize their names. Into this atmosphere of ambition and creativity came Leonardo da Vinci, now 61 years old, and carrying the weight of a lifetime's accumulated wisdom and disappointment. Pope Leo X, born Giovanni de' Medici, had transformed the Vatican into a Renaissance palace where classical learning flourished alongside Christian devotion. The Pope himself was a man of sophisticated tastes who famously declared upon his election that God had given him the papacy to enjoy. His court was a glittering spectacle of wealth and learning, where cardinals competed to display their erudition, and artists vied for the honor of contributing to projects that would glorify both the Church and the Medici name. For Leonardo, this environment offered both tremendous opportunities and new forms of frustration. His reputation preceded him to Rome, where he was received as a living legend whose very presence enhanced the prestige of the papal court. The living quarters provided for him in the Vatican's Belvedere Palace reflected his elevated status. He was given spacious rooms with northern exposure perfect for painting, along with workshops where he could pursue his scientific investigations. A papal library, one of the finest in Europe, was placed at his disposal, giving him access to ancient texts and contemporary scholarship that had been unavailable elsewhere. Yet the Roman environment also presented challenges that tested Leonardo's aging patience. The papal court was dominated by younger artists whose energy and ambition reminded everyone of Leonardo's advancing years. Michelangelo, now 38, and at the height of his powers, had recently completed the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Raphael, still in his 20s, but already recognized as a master, was decorating the papal apartments. The presence of these artistic giants created an atmosphere of intense competition that was both stimulating and exhausting. While Leonardo's reputation commanded respect, his age and history of unfinished projects made some patrons hesitant to entrust him with major commissions. The commission that Pope Leo eventually offered Leonardo reflected both respect for his genius and awareness of his limitations. Rather than a major public work that would require years of sustained effort, the Pope requested a series of smaller projects that would showcase Leonardo's diverse talents while minimizing the risk of delays. These included mechanical devices for papal entertainments, engineering consultations for Vatican construction projects, and scientific investigations that might enhance the Church's reputation for learning. Leonardo approached these assignments with characteristic thoroughness, but his notebooks from the Roman period reveal a mind increasingly absorbed by theoretical questions. His studies of optics led him to investigate the nature of vision itself, producing theories about how the eye processes information that would not be confirmed until the development of modern neuroscience. His mechanical investigations explored principles of energy conservation and transformation that anticipated discoveries that would not be formalized until the Industrial Revolution. The anatomical work that Leonardo pursued in Rome represented perhaps the most advanced scientific research of his entire career. Working with physicians at the Papal Hospital, he was able to perform dissections with unprecedented systematic precision, creating detailed drawings of internal organs that revealed their structure and function with remarkable accuracy. His studies of the human heart, in particular, demonstrated an understanding of cardiac function that would not be equaled until the 17th century. These anatomical investigations were not merely scientific exercises, but part of a larger philosophical project that sought to understand the relationship between body and soul, matter and spirit. He was fascinated by the question of how physical processes could generate consciousness and emotion, how the material substance of the brain could produce the immaterial phenomena of thought and feeling. His drawings from this period show him mapping the nervous system with the precision of a modern neurologist, while simultaneously exploring questions that belonged more to philosophy than medicine. The artistic works that Leonardo completed during his Roman period reflected this tension between vision and possibility. His painting of St. John the Baptist, completed around 1515, showed a figure that seemed to emerge from darkness through subtle gradations of light and shadow that pushed the boundaries of what paint could achieve on canvas. The technical innovations visible in this late work represented the culmination of Leonardo's lifelong investigation into the physics of light and the psychology of perception. Every brushstroke was informed by decades of scientific observation, from his studies of atmospheric perspective to his analysis of how facial muscles create expressions. But even as Leonardo was creating these final masterpieces, his relationship with the papal court was becoming increasingly strained. The younger artists who dominated Roman cultural life operated according to different principles than those that had shaped Leonardo's career. Where he valued investigation and experimentation, they emphasized productivity and completion. The clash of artistic generations became particularly evident in Leonardo's interactions with Michelangelo, whose temperament and methods represented everything that Leonardo found troubling about contemporary artistic practice. Michelangelo worked with passionate intensity, completing major projects through sustained effort and unwavering focus. Leonardo's notebooks from his Roman years reveal growing frustration with the constraints and expectations of traditional patronage. At 63, he was being asked to compete with men half his age in a cultural environment that valued speed and spectacle over the careful investigation and theoretical sophistication that had always driven his work. The scientific investigations that had always been Leonardo's true passion were also becoming more difficult to pursue within the papal court. While Pope Leo genuinely appreciated learning and innovation, the practical demands of governing the church left little time or resources for the kind of open-ended research that Leonardo required. The anatomical work that fascinated him was also viewed with some suspicion by conservative elements within the Vatican, who worried that such detailed study of human corpses might lead to materialist conclusions that contradicted Christian doctrine about the soul's immortality. These tensions came to a head in 1516, when Pope Leo's attention was diverted by the growing crisis of the Protestant Reformation. The challenge posed by Martin Luther's theological criticisms required the Church to focus its resources on defending orthodox doctrine rather than supporting speculative investigations. The invitation that would provide Leonardo with his final refuge came from an unexpected source. Francis I, the young king of France, who had recently ascended to the throne, was eager to demonstrate his cultural sophistication and to attract prestigious figures who could enhance the glory of the French court. Having heard of Leonardo's genius from French nobles who had encountered him during their Italian campaigns, Francis offered the aging master a position that seemed almost too good to be true. The terms were extraordinarily generous. Leonardo would be given a comfortable residence near the royal palace at Ade, and was along with a generous pension that would free him from financial worries. He would have no specific obligations beyond serving as the king's advisor on artistic and scientific matters, and he would be free to pursue whatever investigations interested him. For a man who had spent his entire career balancing his intellectual curiosity against the practical demands of patronage, this arrangement represented the perfect synthesis of security and freedom. The decision to accept Francis I's invitation was not difficult. Rome, for all its artistic opportunities, had become an environment where his age and methods were increasingly seen as obstacles rather than assets. The French court offered not just material comfort, but the respect and appreciation that he had always sought. At 64, Leonardo was ready to leave behind the competitive pressures of Italian cultural life for the more relaxed atmosphere of a court that they valued him for what he had already achieved, rather than demanding constant proof of continued productivity. The journey from Rome to France in the autumn of 1516 marked the beginning of Leonardo's final chapter, a period that would see him recognized not just as a great artist, but as a symbol of human intellectual achievement itself. The notebooks and paintings that he carried with him represented the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime devoted to understanding the natural world. Chapter 6, The Final Years and Eternal Legacy. The Loire Valley that welcomed Leonardo in the winter of 1516 was a landscape of gentle beauty that seemed perfectly suited to the contemplative mood of his final years. The Château du Clos-Luce, which King Francis provided as his residence, was a comfortable manor house surrounded by gardens where he could walk and think without the pressures and distractions that had marked his urban career. For the first time in decades, Leonardo found himself in an environment where his intellectual curiosity was valued for its own sake rather than being seen as an impediment to more practical concerns. The relationship that developed between Leonardo and Francis I was unlike any the artist had experienced with previous patrons. The young king, still in his early 20s, approached the aging master with a mixture of reverence and genuine intellectual curiosity that created an atmosphere of mutual respect and affection. Francis was not simply collecting a prestigious ornament for his court, but seeking to learn from one of the greatest minds of the age. Leonardo responded to this sincere interest with a warmth and openness that had been rare in his earlier relationships with patrons. Their conversations ranged across every conceivable subject, from the mechanics of human anatomy to the design of ideal cities, from the behavior of water to the movements of celestial bodies. Francis was particularly fascinated by Leonardo's engineering concepts, many of which seemed to anticipate technological possibilities that lay far in the future. The aging master would demonstrate mechanical principles using simple models constructed in his workshop, showing how gear ratios could multiply force and how properly designed channels could control water flow with mathematical precision. These informal lessons represented a unique form of education, as one of history's greatest minds shared his accumulated wisdom with a ruler who possessed both the intelligence to understand and the power to potentially implement such innovations. The final 3 years of Leonardo's life unfolded with a serenity that had been absent from his earlier decades of constant movement and uncertainty. At close loose, he established routines that reflected both his advancing age and his enduring intellectual curiosity. His mornings were typically spent in the gardens, where he would walk slowly among carefully tended paths, observing the play of light through leaves and the patterns of growth that had fascinated him since childhood. These daily walks were not merely exercise for an aging body, but continuation of the scientific observation that had defined his approach to understanding the world. Even in his final years, Leonardo filled pages with sketches of plant structures, noting how different species adapted to their environment and how mathematical principles governed their growth patterns. The artistic work that Leonardo produced during these final years was limited but profound. His right hand, weakened by what modern medical experts believe may have been a stroke, could no longer execute the precise brushwork that had characterized his earlier masterpieces. Yet his left hand remained capable, and he adapted his technique to work within these new constraints. The self-portraits from this period show a face marked by age and experience, with flowing hair and penetrating eyes that seem to look beyond the physical world toward deeper truths. These images were not exercises in vanity, but careful studies of how time transforms human features while leaving essential character intact. Leonardo was documenting his own aging process with the same scientific detachment he had brought to his anatomical investigations, creating a visual record of mortality that was both personal and universal. The notebooks that he continued to fill during these years reveal a mind grappling with increasingly philosophical questions about the nature of existence and human consciousness. His earlier investigations had been driven by practical curiosity about how things worked, but his final writings show him pondering why anything existed at all. What purpose might underlie the elaborate mechanisms he had spent a lifetime studying? These meditations on the meaning of life and death gave his final scientific observations a poetic quality that distinguished them from his earlier, more technical writings. On the morning of May 2nd, 1519, in the quiet chambers of Clos Luz, Leonardo da Vinci drew his final breath. The hands that had painted the Mona Lisa's enigmatic smile, that had sketched flying machines centuries before their time, that had dissected human hearts to understand the very essence of life itself, finally came to rest. King Francis I, who rushed to be at his mentor's bedside, would later claim that Leonardo died in his arms, a fitting end for a relationship that had transcended the usual boundaries between patron and artist to become something approaching true understanding between kindred spirits. The death of Leonardo marked more than the passing of a single extraordinary individual. With him died the Renaissance ideal of the universal genius, the belief that one mind could encompass all human knowledge and push the boundaries of every field simultaneously. The world was becoming too complex, too specialized for such comprehensive mastery ever to be achieved again. Leonardo was perhaps the last human being who could legitimately claim expertise in art, science, engineering, anatomy, architecture, music, and philosophy without anyone questioning his credentials in any of these domains. Yet, in another sense, Leonardo's death was not an ending but a beginning. The notebooks he left behind, filled with mirror writing and revolutionary insights, would inspire generations of thinkers and creators who followed. His artistic techniques would influence painters for centuries, while his scientific observations would be rediscovered and validated by researchers working with instruments he could never have imagined. The flying machines that seemed like fantasies in 1519 would take to the skies 4 centuries later, designed according to principles he had first articulated through careful observation of birds in flight. The anatomical drawings that seemed merely artistic exercises revealed themselves to be genuine contributions to medical science when examined by later physicians with access to better preservation techniques and comparative data. The engineering concepts that appeared impossibly ambitious were recognized as brilliantly prescient when industrial technology finally caught up to his vision. Leonardo's greatest gift to humanity may not have been any single painting or invention, but rather his demonstration that the human mind, properly applied, has no limits. He showed that curiosity combined with rigorous observation could unlock secrets of nature that seemed beyond human comprehension. He proved that art and science were not separate domains, but complementary approaches to understanding the same underlying reality. He embodied the possibility that one person, through dedication and genius, could expand the boundaries of human knowledge in multiple directions simultaneously. The paintings he left behind, though relatively few in number, represent some of the highest achievements of visual art ever created. The Mona Lisa continues to captivate viewers half a millennium after its creation. Her smile's still enigmatic, still somehow alive despite the layers of varnish and centuries of scrutiny. The Last Supper, even in its damaged state, remains one of the most powerful religious images ever painted, its psychological depth and compositional brilliance undiminished by time. The notebooks, scattered across collections in Europe and filled with mirror writing that was once a barrier to understanding, have been deciphered and published, revealing to the modern world the extraordinary breadth and depth of Leonardo's investigations. We can now see clearly what his contemporaries could only sense, that they were in the presence of a mind that operated on a different level than other humans. Leonardo's scientific observations, once dismissed as the eccentric hobby of an artist, are now recognized as genuine contributions to human knowledge. His studies of water flow anticipated discoveries in fluid dynamics. His anatomical investigations revealed structures and functions that wouldn't be confirmed for centuries. His mechanical concepts laid groundwork for principles that would become fundamental to engineering. But perhaps most importantly, Leonardo's life demonstrated that genius is not a single gift, but a combination of curiosity, discipline, observation, and the courage to question accepted wisdom. He was not born with complete knowledge, but developed it through decades of patient investigation, filling notebook after notebook with observations, questions, and insights. He made mistakes, pursued dead ends, left projects unfinished, and struggled with the limitations of his historical moment. Yet through it all, he maintained his sense of wonder, his belief that understanding was possible, his conviction that the human mind could penetrate the mysteries of nature through careful study and rigorous thought. As we drift towards sleep tonight, we can take comfort in Leonardo's example. He showed that one person, through dedication and curiosity, can make lasting contributions to human knowledge and create beauty that transcends time. He proved that it is never too late to ask questions, to observe carefully, to seek understanding. His restless intelligence, which sometimes seemed like a curse during his lifetime, preventing him from finishing projects and satisfying patrons, appears in historical perspective as his greatest strength. He couldn't stop questioning because the world was infinitely fascinating, infinitely complex, infinitely worthy of investigation. And so we remember Leonardo, not just for what he accomplished, but for what he represents. The human capacity for wonder, for learning, for creating, for understanding. 500 years after his death, his paintings still move us, his notebooks still inspire us, and his example still challenges us to look at the world with fresh eyes and ask, why? How? What if? Conclusion. Now, as this long journey through Leonardo's extraordinary life comes to a close, let yourself settle deeper into comfort and peace. Feel the softness of your pillow, the warmth of your blankets, the safety of this moment. Leonardo's story spanning 67 years of unceasing curiosity and creation, has unfolded before you like a great painting revealing its details slowly, layer by layer. Take a slow, deep breath and hold the essence of his life gently in your mind. A child born outside the boundaries of respectable society, who became the most famous artist in Europe. A young man who dissected the wings of birds to understand flight. A master who spent years perfecting a smile that would captivate humanity for centuries. Breathe out and let go of any tension remaining in your body. Leonardo's restlessness, his constant searching, his endless questions, all these can dissolve now into the peaceful darkness of sleep. You need not carry his burdens or match his genius. You need only rest in the knowledge that one human being showed what was possible when curiosity meets dedication. Think of the gardens at Close Loose, where the aging Leonardo walked in quiet contemplation, finally free from the demands of patrons and the pressures of competition. Imagine yourself walking those same paths, feeling the French sun warm on your face, hearing birds sing in the trees, watching light play through leaves in patterns that follow mathematical laws as beautiful as they are precise. The water in the Loire River flows as it has for millennia, following the same principles that Leonardo studied with such devotion. The stars wheel overhead in their eternal dance. Governed by laws he tried to understand, the human heart continues to beat its steady rhythm, pumping blood through vessels he mapped with unprecedented accuracy. All of this continues, eternal and unchanging, while you rest. Close your eyes now, or let them grow heavy as they rest on these words. Feel yourself drifting like a leaf on water, following currents that require no effort, no striving, only gentle surrender to the natural flow of things. Leonardo spent his life trying to understand how the world worked. But tonight, you need not understand anything. You need only be existing in this moment of perfect safety and comfort. His paintings have endured for centuries, but they can wait until tomorrow. His notebooks have waited 500 years to be fully appreciated. They can wait a few hours more while you sleep. Let the story of his life become like a lullaby, its details fading into soft impressions. A child drawing in the Tuscan hills, a young man grinding pigments in a Florence workshop, a master painting a smile that would enchant the world, an old man in a French garden, finally at peace. Breathe slowly, deeply, letting each exhale carry away any remaining thoughts or concerns. Leonardo's genius was extraordinary, but your simple existence in this moment is its own kind of miracle. You are alive, conscious, capable of rest and renewal. This is enough. This is everything. The great artist who sought to understand all things finally found peace in a manor house by a French river, surrounded by gardens and respect. His searching mind at last content to simply observe and appreciate. You too can find that peace now, that gentle acceptance of rest after effort, of sleep after waking. Let yourself drift now, floating on the river of sleep as gently as light playing on water, as naturally as breath flowing in and out, as peacefully as the aged Leonardo resting in his final home. The story is told. The journey is complete. All that remains is rest. Sleep well, dear traveler through history. Sleep deeply and peacefully. Leonardo's genius has illuminated the path, but you need not walk it tonight. Tonight is for dreams, for restoration, for the gentle darkness that nurtures all life. Good night, rest well, and may your dreams be as beautiful as the smile he painted, as ambitious as the wings he designed, as peaceful as the garden where he spent his final days. The story ends, but you continue, breathing softly, resting completely, held safely in this moment of perfect peace.